The small transport vessel drifted through the endless black of space, tumbling slowly as its engines sputtered and died. Warning lights blinked across every control panel, bathing the cockpit in an eerie red glow. Young Rocky's feathers trembled as he pressed buttons and pulled levers, trying desperately to restart the failing systems. Rocky belonged to the Windborn, a species that looked like a mix between birds and people. His feathers were a soft blue color that usually sparkled in the light, but now they were dull with fear and worry. He was only 12 years old, barely old enough to help with simple cargo runs between his people's colonies. Please work, he whispered, his voice shaking as he tried the engine restart sequence again. Nothing happened. The ship continued its lonely drift through space, getting colder by the minute. This wasn't supposed to happen. It was meant to be an easy trip, pick up supplies from Colony 3, and bring them back home to Colony 1. Rocky's parents had finally trusted him to handle the family's small cargo ship by himself. He had made the run 5 times before with his father, and everything had always gone perfectly. But this time, something went terribly wrong. First, the navigation system started showing strange readings. Then the engines began making odd noises. Before Rocky could turn back, there was a loud bang from the engine room, and everything started shutting down. The life support system's display caught his eye, showing dangerous numbers that kept getting worse. The air recyclers were failing. The heating system was already dead. Rocky could see his breath forming little clouds in front of his beak. He wrapped his wings around himself, trying to stay warm. The Windborn weren't built for cold. Their hollow bones and light frames helped them fly in their home world's low gravity, but they needed warmth to survive. Already, his fingers felt stiff as he worked the controls. The distress beacon was still working, at least. Its weak signal pulsed out into space every few seconds, but Rocky knew how unlikely it was that anyone would hear it. He had drifted far off the regular trade routes, pushed by the last random bursts from the failing engines. This part of space was empty. No planets, no stations, no regular ship traffic. In his panic, Rocky had tried calling his parents on the emergency communicator, but the power wasn't strong enough to reach that far. The message just bounced back, lost in the vastness of space. Hours passed slowly. Rocky checked and rechecked every system, hoping to find something he could fix. But the problems were in the main power core. Something had broken deep inside the engine room, and he couldn't even get back there because the emergency doors had sealed shut. The air grew thinner. Rocky found himself taking deeper breaths just to get enough oxygen. His movements became slower as the cold seeped into his bones. He thought about his parents, probably still busy at the colony market, not yet worried about why he was late. By the time they realized something was wrong, it might be too late. The voices of his flight instructors echoed in his head. Stay calm in an emergency, they had always said. Panic makes everything worse. Rocky tried to follow their advice, but it was hard when he could see the life support numbers dropping lower and lower. He pulled out the emergency supplies from under his seat, a thin thermal blanket and some emergency ration bars. The blanket helped a little with the cold, but he knew it wouldn't last long. The ship's walls weren't designed to keep heat in without power to the thermal systems. As Rocky huddled in his pilot's seat, watching the stars drift past the viewport, he remembered all the stories he'd heard about the dangers of space. His grandfather used to say that space was like a vast ocean, beautiful but deadly. Never take it for granted, he would warn. Always respect its power. Now Rocky understood those warnings better than ever. Space was so big, and he was so small. His ship was just a tiny speck of metal, floating in an endless void. The distress beacon kept beeping steadily, but each pulse seemed weaker than the last, like a fading heartbeat. Frost started forming on the inside of the viewport. Rocky's feathers were puffed out as far as they could go, trying to trap what little warmth remained in his body. He knew he should stay awake, should keep trying to find a solution, but his eyes felt so heavy. The cold made him want to sleep. In his increasingly cloudy thoughts, Rocky remembered the last thing his mother had said to him before this trip. "Be careful out there, my little starflyer." He wished he had hugged her longer before leaving. If only he had checked the engines one more time before departure. If only he had stayed closer to the trade routes. If only. The distress beacon kept pulsing, sending its desperate message into the darkness. "Help, please help. Someone help." Hansol sat in the pilot's seat of her cargo ship, sipping the last of her cold coffee. The Star Runner hummed steadily around her, its aging engines pushing them through the darkness of space. She had been making the same supply run for years. Pick up medical supplies from Earth Station 7, deliver them to the outer colonies, then head back with local goods. The ship's computer beeped softly, drawing her attention. A faint signal was appearing on the long-range scanners. Hansol leaned forward, adjusting the sensors to get a better reading. It was a distress beacon, but the signal was weak, barely detectable against the background noise of space. "Computer, analyze distress signal," she commanded, already plotting a course adjustment in her head. The computer took a few seconds to process the data. Signal origin: unknown design. Distance: approximately 3 hours at maximum speed. Signal indicates critical life support failure. Hansol didn't hesitate. She punched in the new coordinates and diverted power to the engines. The Star Runner's deck plates vibrated as the ship accelerated to emergency speed. Her delivery deadline would be missed. The medical supplies were supposed to reach Colony 9 by tomorrow morning. But Hansol had never been able to ignore a cry for help. She remembered her first rescue mission 10 years ago. Another cargo pilot had gotten caught in an asteroid field, their engines damaged. Hansol had reached them just in time. The look of relief on their faces when she opened the airlock had stayed with her ever since. As the Star Runner raced toward the distress signal, Hansol checked her emergency equipment. The ship's medical bay was basic but functional. The spare oxygen tanks were full. The emergency repair kit was well stocked. She had insisted on maintaining all safety systems perfectly, even when money was tight. 2 hours into the journey, the ship's sensors picked up more details about the distressed vessel. It was small, maybe a quarter of the Star Runner size. Its design was like nothing Hansol had ever seen before. The hull had strange curves and projections that didn't match any known human or alien designs in her database. "Computer, any match for the ship's configuration?" she asked, studying the sensor readings. "Negative. Design does not match any registered vessel types." This made things more complicated. Unknown alien ships could be dangerous. Some species were hostile to humans, and distress calls had been used as traps before. But Hansol's instincts told her this was genuine. The way the ship was tumbling suggested real engine failure, and the life support readings were critically low. She activated her ship's external cameras as they got closer. The strange vessel came into view, spinning slowly in space. Its hull had an iridescent quality, almost like bird feathers. There were no visible weapons, and the design seemed more artistic than military. Hansol opened a general broadcast channel. "Unknown vessel, this is cargo ship Star Runner. We've received your distress signal. Can you respond?" Static was her only answer. She tried different frequencies, but nothing worked. Either their communications were dead, or they used completely different technology. The Star Runner's lights illuminated the alien ship as Hansol brought them alongside. Through the viewport, she could see frost forming on the other ship's windows. Their heating systems were definitely offline. If anyone was still alive in there, they wouldn't last much longer in the cold. Hansol had learned long ago that space was unforgiving. Every minute could mean the difference between life and death. She began the docking procedures, even though she wasn't sure if their systems would be compatible. "Computer, scan for life signs," she ordered, watching the alien ship grow larger in her viewport. One life form detected. Readings indicate severely reduced body temperature. Someone was still alive in there, but barely. Hansol's hands flew over the controls, preparing for emergency rescue procedures. She had done this before with human ships, but an alien vessel would present new challenges. The Star Runner's sensors mapped the other ship's hull, looking for a way in. The usual docking points were all wrong. They seemed designed for a completely different type of connection. Han Sol would have to get creative. She pulled on her spacesuit, checking every seal twice. The emergency kit was strapped to her belt, along with tools she might need. Even after 15 years in space, putting on a suit still made her slightly nervous. One tiny hole, one failed seal, and the vacuum of space would kill her in seconds. But there was no time for fear. Someone needed help, human or not. Han Sol looked one last time at the frost-covered windows of the alien ship, wondering what she would find inside. Then she headed for the airlock, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The Star Runner's computers continued monitoring both ships as Han Sol prepared for her rescue attempt. The alien vessel's life support readings kept dropping. Time was running out, and she was their only hope in this empty corner of space. Han Sol's breath caught in her throat as she finally got a clear view through the alien ship's viewport. In the dim emergency lights, she saw not the adult alien she had expected, but a child. The young creature looked like a blend of bird and person, with delicate blue feathers that shimmered even in the weak light. Its large eyes were filled with fear as it stared back at her. "It's just a kid," she whispered to herself inside her spacesuit. The discovery made her heart ache. The young alien was pressed against the pilot's seat, wings wrapped tightly around itself. Even through the thick glass, Han Sol could see it shivering. She tried the emergency frequencies again, speaking clearly into her helmet mic. "This is Han Sol of the Star Runner. I'm here to help. Can you understand me?" The only response was static and a frightened flutter of feathers from the alien child. The ship's computer chimed in her ear. "Temperature in alien vessel approaching critical levels. Estimate 15 minutes until hypothermia becomes severe." Han Sol needed to act fast, but she also needed the child to trust her. She pulled out her datapad and held it up to the viewport. With quick strokes, she drew a simple picture: two stick figures, one with wings and one without, standing together beside a spaceship. She pointed to herself, then to the drawing, trying to show her peaceful intentions. The young alien uncurled slightly, tilting its head in a distinctly bird-like manner. It reached out with a trembling hand and touched the viewport from its side. Han Sol pressed her gloved hand against the glass from her side, matching the gesture. She drew another picture: the winged figure moving from one ship to another through a connecting tube. The alien child watched intently as she worked, its feathers slowly relaxing from their frightened puff. The universal translator in Han Sol's suit was useless. It had no reference for the alien's language. She tried simple gestures instead, pointing to herself, then to her ship, then making a welcoming motion. The young alien's eyes followed her movements carefully. Frost was creeping across the viewport between them. Han Sol could see the child's movements becoming slower, more sluggish. The cold was taking its toll. She needed to get inside that ship now, before it was too late. She held up 5 fingers, then pointed to herself, then the airlock. The alien seemed to understand she was trying to communicate a plan. It nodded, a surprisingly human-like gesture that gave Han Sol hope. Working quickly, she attached safety lines between the two ships. The alien child watched her every move, pressing close to the viewport despite the cold. Han Sol kept making reassuring gestures whenever she could, trying to maintain the fragile trust they had established. The alien ship's hull was covered in intricate patterns that Han Sol now realized were meant to mimic feathers. The design was beautiful, but it made finding a safe entry point challenging. She scanned carefully with her suit's sensors, looking for any sign of an airlock or emergency hatch. Finally, she found what seemed to be an entry port. The mechanism was strange, clearly designed for beings with different hands than humans, but Han Sol had years of experience with various alien technologies. She could figure this out. She gestured to the alien child again, pointing to the entry port, then herself. The young creature nodded again, but its movements were becoming worryingly slow. The cold was winning the battle against its small body. Hansol pulled out her tools and began working on the alien airlock. Every few seconds, she glanced through the viewport, making sure the child was still conscious. The young alien watched her with half-closed eyes, its feathers dusted with frost. "Just hold on," Hansol whispered, though she knew the alien couldn't hear her. "Just a few more minutes. Stay with me, little one." Her hands moved quickly but carefully over the unfamiliar mechanisms. One wrong move could damage the airlock beyond repair. The child's life depended on her getting this right the first time. Inside her suit, sweat rolled down her face despite the cold of space. This was the most delicate part of any rescue, making first contact while trying to save a life. The young alien's trust was as fragile as ice, and just as likely to shatter if she made a wrong move. But Hansol had never failed a rescue yet, and she wasn't about to start now. Not with a child's life on the line. She kept working, her determination growing stronger with each passing moment. Somewhere in the darkness of space, this young alien's family was waiting for their child to come home. Hansol intended to make sure they weren't disappointed. Hansol floated back to study the docking area of the alien ship, her heart sinking as she examined the connection points. Nothing matched up with her ship's standard docking equipment. Where human ships had straight, rigid docking collars, this vessel had curved, flexible ports that spiraled open like flower petals. "This isn't going to be simple," she muttered inside her helmet, running her gloved hand along the alien metal. The young alien watched her through the viewport, its feathers now covered in a thick layer of frost. The ship's temperature readings were still dropping rapidly. Hansol pushed off from the hull and propelled herself back to the Star Runner's cargo hold. She had a plan forming, but it would take every bit of her 15 years of space experience to pull it off. The hold was packed with supply crates, spare parts, and emergency equipment. She grabbed what she needed: flexible tubing meant for repairing air systems, emergency seal foam canisters, spare hull plates, and a collection of tools. Working in zero gravity made everything harder, but Hansol had learned long ago how to move efficiently in space. Time was running out. The alien child, Rocky, as she had managed to understand from their simple attempts at communication, was getting weaker by the minute. Hansol could see through the viewport that the young one's movements were becoming dangerously slow. She started with the flexible tubing, carefully measuring and cutting sections. The tube needed to be long enough to reach between the ships but short enough to maintain structural integrity. Her hands moved quickly, connecting pieces and sealing joints. The emergency seal foam was tricky to work with in space. The foam expanded on contact with air, hardening into an airtight seal, but it had to be applied perfectly the first time. There would be no second chances if she got it wrong. "Computer, how long until complete life support failure in the alien vessel?" she asked as she worked. "Approximately 47 minutes at current rate of deterioration." Hansol worked faster. She attached the makeshift docking tube to her ship first, using the seal foam to create an airtight connection. The foam expanded around the tube, white and puffy against the dark metal of the hull. The harder part would be connecting to the alien ship. The curved, pedal-like ports would need special adaptation. Hansol cut hull plates into curved sections, creating a collar that would match the alien design. Her hands were starting to shake from exhaustion, but she couldn't stop now. Through the viewport, she could see Rocky pressing weakly against the glass, watching her work. The young alien's eyes were having trouble staying open. Hypothermia was setting in. "Stay with me, kid," Hansol said, though she knew Rocky couldn't hear her. "Just a little longer." She moved back to the alien ship with her modified connection piece. The curved plates had to be perfectly aligned with the pedal-like port. One small gap would make the whole thing useless. Hansol took a deep breath and began applying the seal foam. The foam expanded quickly in the vacuum of space, filling every tiny gap between the curved plates and the alien port. Hansol held the pieces steady, counting the seconds until the foam hardened. If this didn't work, she wouldn't have enough materials for another attempt. Finally, the foam set. Hansol attached the flexible tube to her modified connection piece, sealing it carefully. Now came the moment of truth. She had to pressurize the tube and see if it would hold. Computer, begin gradual pressurization of emergency docking tube. Monitor for any leaks. Air slowly filled the tube. Hansol watched anxiously as the flexible material expanded. The seals held at both ends. No leaks appeared. It had worked. She moved quickly back to her ship's airlock. The makeshift docking tube looked strange, a combination of human and alien technology, held together by emergency foam and determination. But it would serve its purpose. Hansol cycled through her ship's airlock and made her way through the tube. The flexible walls creaked around her, but the seals remained solid. She reached the alien ship's port and carefully activated the opening mechanism she had studied earlier. The pedals spiraled open smoothly, despite the cold. Hansol pushed through into the alien vessel, immediately feeling the bitter cold even through her suit. Ice crystals floated in the stale air. Rauki was still in the pilot's seat, but barely conscious now. The young alien's feathers were stiff with ice, and its breathing was shallow. Hansol moved carefully closer, not wanting to frighten the child in these critical moments. She had done it, created a bridge between two completely different technologies, between two species who had never met before. Now she just had to get Rauki safely across it. The hardest part of the rescue was about to begin. Rauki's mind was foggy from the cold, but he could still hear his grandfather's warnings echoing in his head. Never trust the groundbound ones, the old windborn would say, his feathers bristling. They cannot understand the way of wings and wind. Yet here was one of these groundbound creatures, a human, working frantically to save his life. Through ice-frosted windows, Rauki watched her movements with growing fascination. She worked with quick, sure motions, her strange tool-holding hands moving with surprising grace in the emptiness of space. His whole body shivered violently. The ship's temperature had dropped so low that ice crystals formed in the air around him. Rauki's feathers, usually so sleek and bright, were stiff with frost. Each breath was harder than the last. The human, Hansol, she had somehow communicated, kept glancing at him through the viewport as she worked. Her face was visible behind her helmet's clear shield, and Rauki could see worry in her eyes. Not the predator's gaze his elders had warned about, but genuine concern. She had drawn pictures to communicate, simple images that reminded Rauki of the story drawings young Windborn made in school. The human wanted to help him cross to her ship, but everything Rauki had ever learned told him that leaving his ship would mean death. Another violent shiver racked his body. The emergency lights flickered, growing dimmer. Rauki could barely feel his fingers anymore. The cold was winning, seeping into his bones, making his thoughts slow and sluggish. Through the viewport, he watched Hansol complete her strange tunnel between the ships. It looked nothing like the elegant docking systems the Windborn used, but there was a certain beauty in its resourcefulness. She had built a bridge between their worlds using nothing but spare parts and determination. Rauki's vision blurred, but he forced himself to focus as Hansol entered his ship through the emergency airlock. Her space suit looked bulky and awkward to his eyes, so different from the sleek pressure suits his people wore. She moved carefully toward him, her hands held out in a gesture that somehow managed to be both alien and reassuring. The young Windborn's heart raced. This was the closest he'd ever been to a human. Up close, she looked even stranger. No feathers, flat face, five-fingered hands. Everything about her was wrong according to his people's teachings. But those teachings hadn't saved him when his ship failed. Those ancient warnings couldn't keep him warm now. And this human, this groundbound creature, had come to help when no one else could hear his distress call. Hansol reached out slowly, offering her hand. Rauki stared at it, remembering all the stories of humans who had hurt his people in the past. But he also remembered watching her work tirelessly outside his ship, refusing to give up even when the first attempts failed. His ship groaned around them, metal contracting in the killing cold. The sound seemed to echo the choice in Rocky's mind. Trust or die, change or fade away. The human's hand remained steady, waiting. With the last of his strength, Rocky reached out and took it. Her gloved fingers closed gently around his, warm even through the protective material. He let her help him up from the pilot's seat, his legs shaking from cold and fear. Hansol supported him as they made their way to the makeshift tunnel. Rocky's wings dragged behind him, too cold to hold properly. Each step was a battle against his instincts, every movement a rejection of generations of prejudice. They'd reached the tunnel entrance. Through it, Rocky could see the human's ship waiting. It looked solid and warm, but so alien. He hesitated at the threshold, his freezing body warring with his frightened mind. Hansol squeezed his hand gently. When he looked up at her, she nodded encouragingly. Despite their differences, despite the barrier of language and species, that simple gesture carried a clear message. I won't let you fall. Rocky took a deep breath of the thin, cold air. Then, leaning on the human's strength, he stepped into the tunnel. Each movement carried him further from everything he knew, from the teachings of his people, from the familiar safety of his own ship. But it also carried him toward life, toward warmth, toward a future he had never imagined. With each step through the makeshift tunnel, Rocky felt something changing inside him. Trust, he realized, was like flying. Sometimes you had to leap into the empty air before your wings could catch you. Behind them, his ship's emergency lights finally flickered and died, plunging his old life into darkness. But ahead, through the human's viewport, stars shone bright and clear. Different stars than he had known before, seen through different eyes. Rocky squeezed Hansol's hand back, matching her earlier gesture. Maybe his grandfather had been wrong. Maybe there was more to learn about the groundbound ones than their old stories told. And maybe, just maybe, this strange human with her determined eyes and gentle hands could teach him things his own people never could. The warmth of the Star Runner's interior hit Rocky like a wave as they finally made it through the airlock. His frozen feathers began to thaw, sending sharp tingles through his entire body. Hansol quickly guided him to a space she had prepared in the cargo hold, a corner where she had adjusted the artificial gravity to be lighter, more like his homeworld. Rocky sank gratefully onto the soft padding Hansol had arranged. She had somehow known that Windborn needed to perch rather than lie flat like humans did. The air here felt different too, richer in oxygen, with a subtle warmth that helped his frozen limbs begin to recover. Hansol brought him a thermal blanket and what looked like a cup of hot liquid. She mined drinking, then made an exaggerated expression of warming up. Rocky couldn't help but trill a small laugh at her theatrical gestures. He carefully took the cup in his still shaking hands. The drink was unlike anything he had tasted before, sweet and warm, with a rich flavor that seemed to chase away the last of the bone-deep cold. Hansol watched him drink, nodding in approval when he finished the cup. Over the next few hours, they began to develop their own way of talking. Rocky would point to objects and say their names in his language, and Hansol would respond with the human words. They drew pictures, made gestures, and slowly built a bridge between their languages. Ship, Hansol would say, pointing to the Star Runner's walls. Kretal, Rocky would respond, then try to repeat her word. Ship. Hansol spent most of her time in the pilot's seat, sending messages to space stations and authorities. Rocky could hear her voice, firm and determined, as she explained the situation again and again. Sometimes her tone would rise in frustration, but she never gave up. The young Windborn watched her work with growing admiration. She had missed her delivery deadline, something he gathered was very important for cargo pilots, but she seemed concerned only with getting him home safely. When she wasn't talking to authorities, Hansol would check on him regularly. She brought food that, while strange to his taste, was carefully chosen to be safe for his physiology. She adjusted the temperature and gravity settings until they felt just right. Roki discovered that humans had their own version of preening. Hansol showed him how to use a heated cloth to help his feathers dry properly after their freezing. She watched with fascination as his natural colors emerge, the iridescent blue shimmering under the ship's lights. They passed the time-sharing stories through their makeshift sign language. Rocky told her about his family's shipping business, about learning to fly in the light gravity of his homeworld. Hansol shared tales of other rescues she had made, drawing pictures of different ships and situations. Sometimes they would just sit in comfortable silence, watching the stars stream past the viewport. Rocky noticed that Hansol had adjusted their course several times, always seeking the fastest route to the nearest space station where help waited. One sleep cycle into their journey, Rocky woke to hear Hansol arguing with someone over the comm system. Her voice was tired but determined as she explained again why she had missed her delivery deadline. The young Windborn felt a pang of guilt, but when Hansol caught him watching, she just smiled and gave him a reassuring gesture they had developed, a wing-like wave that meant all is well. They created a routine aboard the Star Runner. During rest periods, Rocky would perch in his corner of the cargo hold, while Hansol slept in her pilot's chair, always ready to respond to any messages about their situation. During active periods, they would share meals, practice their growing vocabulary of shared words, and check the ship's progress toward their destination. Rocky began to understand more about humans through watching Hansol. They might not have wings or feathers, but they had their own kind of grace. Their hands, with their many fingers, could create and fix things in ways his people never imagined. And their determination, especially Hansol's, seemed to know no bounds. When they finally received confirmation that a Windborn ship was on its way to meet them, both Hansol and Rocky celebrated in their own ways. She performed what she called the victory dance, making him trill with laughter at her awkward movements. He responded by displaying his feathers in the traditional pattern of gratitude, which made her smile in delight. The Star Runner might have been designed for humans, but during their journey, it became a place where two very different species learned they weren't so different after all. Rocky discovered that trust, once given, could grow stronger with each passing moment. And Hansol showed him that sometimes the best way to honor your people's teachings was to learn when to set them aside. As they approached the rendezvous point, Rocky realized he would miss this strange human ship with its boxy corridors and artificial gravity. But most of all, he would miss the human who had risked everything to save a young Windborn who had been raised to fear her kind. The space station's docking bay hummed with tension as the Star Runner made its final approach. Word had spread quickly through both human and Windborn communities about the unprecedented rescue, and now representatives from both species waited anxiously behind the airlock doors. When those doors finally opened, the gathered crowd witnessed something none had seen before. A young Windborn walking wing in hand with a human cargo pilot, both smiling as if this were the most natural thing in the world. Rocky's parents rushed forward, their feathers puffed with emotion, but stopped short at the sight of their son's trust in this human stranger. Rocky broke into a run, his wings spreading with joy as he flew into his parents' embrace. Hansol stood back, watching with tired satisfaction as the family reunited. She wasn't expecting Rocky to break free from his parents' wings and return to her side, taking her hand once more. In the simple language they had developed during their journey, Rocky introduced Hansol to his parents. His father's feathers slowly relaxed from their defensive posture as Rocky explained, through gesture and their shared words, how this human had saved his life. The story spread quickly through both communities. Many Windborn had to reconsider their long-held beliefs about humans being dangerous ground-bound creatures. The sight of Rocky's family formally thanking Hansol, performing the sacred feather blessing that had never before been given to a human, became a powerful symbol of change. Months passed, and the impact of that rescue continued to grow. Hansol found herself invited to speak at both human and Windborn space academies, sharing her experience and the innovative solutions she had developed. The makeshift docking tube she had created became the basis for new universal emergency docking standards. Rocky, changed forever by his experience, threw himself into learning everything he could about humans. He studied their languages, their cultures, their ways of thinking. His parents, seeing how the experience had matured their son, supported his growing interest in cross-species relations. Years later, a much taller Rocky stood before a mixed council of humans and Windborn, his feathers gleaming with adult colors. He had become the youngest member of the newly formed Joint Space Rescue Coalition, an organization dedicated to breaking down the barriers between species in times of crisis. Han Sol attended that first council meeting, her hair now streaked with gray, but her eyes still bright with the same determination that had driven her to save a strange alien child. She watched with pride as Rocky presented their story, using it to illustrate why old prejudices had no place in the vastness of space. The Star Runner's registry number, SR-247, became more than just a cargo ship's identification. Space stations began using it as a code for cross-species emergency situations. We have an SR-247 meant that old rules needed to be set aside, that saving lives mattered more than maintaining traditional boundaries. Rocky made it his life's work to build bridges between humans and Windborn. He established exchange programs, allowing young members of both species to learn from each other. The sight of human children learning to adapt to low gravity, while Windborn youngsters explored human technology, became increasingly common. Han Sol continued her cargo runs, but her ship now carried more than just supplies. She became known as someone who would stop to help any vessel in distress, regardless of species. Other pilots, both human and Windborn, began to follow her example. The emergency protocols developed after Rocky's rescue saved countless lives over the years. Ships were retrofitted with universal docking adapters, crews were trained in cross-species first aid, and communication systems were designed to bridge the gap between different species languages. As Rocky grew older, he never forgot those desperate hours in his failing ship or the warmth of welcome aboard the Star Runner. He kept in touch with Han Sol, their friendship deepening over the years. They met regularly at space stations, sharing meals and stories, their different physiologies no barrier to their bond. 20 years after the rescue, Rocky stood beside Han Sol as she received the highest honor both their species could bestow, the Star of Common Hope, a newly created award for those who brought their peoples closer together. The medal depicted a human hand and a Windborn wing, reaching for each other across the stars. The simple act of one human choosing to help one alien child had grown into something far larger than either of them had imagined. It proved that compassion could indeed transcend the boundaries of species, that trust given freely could change not just two lives, but entire civilizations. In the end, the story of Rocky and Han Sol became required learning for all spacefaring youth, human and Windborn alike. It taught them that sometimes the bravest thing wasn't facing danger, but facing change, that the greatest adventures often began with a simple choice to trust.